My name is Herman Rosenfeld. I'm with the Socialist Project. I'm also with the Free Transit Toronto, and I've been with TTC Writers for about, I think, 5, 6, 7 years almost, something like that. And this session we gave it a title, Lower Fares, More Service, Public Transit Struggles in and After the Pandemic. And we're going to have 3 speakers, Stefan Kipfer, Vincent Puhaka, and Shelagh Pizey-Allen, and I'm going to introduce them right now. Who they are. Stefan is an associate professor with environmental and urban change in York. He's an activist on urban social movements, the environment, and political change. He's a member of Free Transit Toronto, and he's been involved in various projects over the years to try and link public transit to other kinds of issues. Vincent Puhaka is an activist, organizer, and spokesperson with TTC Writers in Toronto. For a young fellow, he's got a lot of accolades there. He holds down a full-time job distinct from his activist work, which gives you a sense of what he has to do to do this stuff, and still plays an important role in speaking for and building the movement. He lives in the West End, but grew up and got his feet wet as an activist in Scarborough. And that helped shape his activism when he first got involved. And Shelagh Pizey-Allen is the executive director of TTC Writers. She's originally from Winnipeg, and she's built the organization outward and deeper than it was before, and combines a number of tasks in the process, keeping up with responding to and organizing others to respond to transit developments, organizing on-the-ground movement in TTC Writers, especially out of the downtown core where we originated, and helping to personally engage in and coordinating relationships with political actors, the activist movement, and people who are movers and shakers in the transit. It's a pretty very responsible stuff. She's got a lot of stuff to do to make this happen. Okay, public transit in Toronto. I just have a couple of sentences to introduce. And cities and towns across Canada and the entire continent have long been squeezed by neoliberal austerity measures and traditional commitments by a number of political leaders and elites to autocentric travel and behaviors. For this, public transit has always been perched on the edge of crisis, leading to overcrowding, underservicing of key working class and racialized communities, reliance on fares which seem always to rise above inflation, breakdowns in services, and the like. Now, though, a new level of crisis has hit public transit systems tied to the dramatic economic and social consequences associated with the pandemic period. It shapes all of the ongoing challenges facing public transit and exacerbates the ones from before. How do we respond to this? How do we analyze it? That's the subjects of today's panel. So our first guest is Stefan Kipfer.
Yes, thank you, Herman. I'm glad to be part of this. I'm just going to try and use the screen here. Okay, very good. Well, I'll try and speak to some of the challenges public transit faces during and after COVID-19. And of course, it goes without saying that, as Herman indicated, that we find ourselves in a situation of crisis when it comes to transit and many other things. But this crisis may also present some opportunities, or at least tensions, useful tensions for those of us who organize to defend transit, to expand transit, and to make transit free. I thought it would make some sense to think about transit challenges by thinking of the various roles transportation and transit play in our capitalist world. And on this front, one of the roles that transportation and transit play is simply as an industrial product, right? Not just as a means of transportation, but also simply as a product of capitalist development. And here, the initial crisis we can see is the challenge we can see has to do with the fact that the initial crisis of the fossil passenger transportation sectors, the airline sectors and the car sectors, is now giving way, or has been giving way, to a renewed concerted attempt of these same fossil industries to expand their stranglehold over people's mobilities. Of course, a key example in metropolitan transport are electric car companies led by Tesla and now joined by all the other majors, and platform capitalists such as Uber and Lyft. And their offensive is part of a trend which has accelerated in the pandemic. A trend related to the strategy of high-tech capitalists, from Google to Amazon, to consolidate their strategic position in global capitalism. The success of this particular sector, the fossil transportation sector, will not be a function of the effectiveness of the car in terms of mobility, or even the profitability of these companies. It will be a function of their capacity to gain a state-protected and state-subsidized quasi-monopoly status. We've seen efforts to push this already here in Ontario, with Ford's attempt to impose conditions on transit funding, allowing private companies access to the system. We've seen it also in Quebec, with Quebec's new automotive strategy to push electric cars. The problem we also know here is simple. I don't think we need to discuss this any further. The problem with this strategy is very simple. E-cars and platform cars remain just that, cars. No matter what no matter how they are, no matter what kind of energy they're using. Now, obviously, this particular challenge leads us to think about ways of pushing a green labor community industrial strategy that prioritizes the production of trains, of streetcars and LRTs, of bikes and related infrastructure. Conversion of existing industries for this purpose should be an important part of this strategy. And here maybe there is a bit of an opportunity, because I think we've seen in various corners of the world a certain appetite to mobilize and even resist the network monopolists and their rent-seeking strategy. Right? We see this in Europe and the US and a few other places around the world. Now, the second set of challenges has to do with the more conventional view of transportation and transit as modes of circulation, right? As ways of moving goods and laborers, of connecting production and consumption at various scales. And there are really two challenges here that I can see. The first one is related to the fact that the public health crisis and the world economic slump have led to a drastic reduction in public transit use. Now, this slump is not as big as the slump in airline traffic, but it is bigger than the slump in car use. And indeed, the decrease in transit ridership has been particularly deep in North America, where it's been deeper than in various parts of East Asia, for example, or various parts of Europe. Clearly, without reversing this decrease in ridership, we will see a disproportionate increase in individualized and car-oriented transportation as capitalism and economic growth ramps up again. The related challenge here is that the economic crisis and the lockdowns have also shifted the overall social composition of who uses transit. Particularly in North America, ridership is made up now more than ever of people who have neither a car nor the option to stay off work or work from home. As we know in Toronto, this concerns above all low-income workers of color, particularly in the northwest corner of the post-war suburbs. That corner is part of the warehouse and manufacturing zone surrounding the airport in Mississauga, in Brampton, in Etobicoke, and in Vaughan. Now, at one level, this decrease and shift in transit ridership greatly increases the obstacles for transit advocacy. Right? It threatens to residualize public transit. At the same time, the opportunity here is that this shift in transit ridership clarifies the class and race basis of transit dependency, and also clarifies the starting point for transit advocacy that is rooted in social and environmental justice. The demands here are clear: expand transit service, and make it as safe and accessible as possible, preferably free. The third way to think about transportation and transit is simply to look at it as a product of state intervention, of policy and planning. And here we can see that the decrease in transit ridership all over the world threatens to lead to a vicious cycle of revenue decline, shrinking service levels, and wholesale public disinvestment in public transit. This vicious cycle may be part of a general fiscal crisis of the local state that looms on the horizon in various parts of the world, and certainly in Canada and the United States. It is also important to point out that states have been much slower bailing out transit authorities than they have been in bailing out fossil industries, and indeed pumping billions of dollars in wage and tax subsidies to keep the economy going, irrespective of the social and ecological usefulness of the industries in question. In fact, the United Nations Environmental Programme has just reported that the bulk of the $12 trillion that states have spent in response to the pandemic since March has primarily, and I'm quoting directly here, has primarily supported the global status quo of high carbon economic production or had neutral effects on carbon emissions. Among the G20, which includes Canada, very few have put words into action in terms of low carbon rescue and recovery measures. Now, this obviously is a very big problem. It does mean that some of the opportunities that we had earlier in the crisis are, I wouldn't say going away, but certainly are moving further into the horizon. At the same time, though, I think it's still important, despite the right populist and the right libertarian anti-mask protests, that the pandemic has certainly questioned the legitimacy and feasibility of privatized and individualist solutions to collective problems. It has also reminded people of how deeply dependent capitalists, and individual persons are on collective infrastructure and collective capacities. On the transportation front, therefore, there is still room to insist on alternatives to private and motorized forms of transportation, to demand that pro-transit, pro-pedestrian, and pro-cyclist mobility strategies be a crucial part of a green and just recovery. In fact, a strong eco-socialist perspective of economic and ecological transformation. Some immediate demands in Canada that should be perhaps mentioned here, and many people have made them and are making them right now. One of them is to make emergency transit funding permanent at all levels, and beyond that, develop a federal role in various types of public transportation, from metropolitan transit to the VIA system, to a possible new national bus service. And this new federal role would not have to be all about big infrastructure, as the feds like to think about it. It should also focus heavily on operating funding and be nimble enough to develop non-car forms of transportation where it's been difficult to develop, in various suburban parts of our cities, for example, and of course in intercity transportation. These are the areas where transit is most vulnerable to the strategies of the platform monopolists. The final thing I want to sort of highlight and spend a bit more time on is a fourth aspect of transportation and transit, which is ultimately also a way for us to experience mobility and modernity, a way of living modern life in all its tensions and contradictions, instead of trying to avoid them or sidestep them. So on this front, the pandemic, and here is perhaps where I'm a bit pessimistic, I must say, is that the pandemic has reignited a very long and standing and very deep-seated fear of being around others, particularly in North America. And this fear has been cultivated repeatedly over the last 150 years for many reasons, including legitimate public health considerations that have been turned into veritable hygienic obsessions over the last 150 years. This fear of complicated life is literally built into the assumptions that have guided planning and city building in such a way as to allow us to distance ourselves from each other as much as possible. How has this happened over the last 150 years? With the help of land use zoning mechanisms, with various forms of spatially extensive, largely privatized forms of mass suburbanization. And so much before the pandemic, these kinds of trends have helped make automobility the normal, distant, and suspicious way in which people relate to the landscape and each other. Today, the fear of transit as a form of experiencing mobility is expressed in surveys that show that a proportion of transit users, typically a significant minority, say that they will try to avoid transit if they can, even in the future. This fear is an understandable but not fully rational response to the pandemic. It contributes to a pre-existing hostility towards genuine public space, expressed in typically racialized and class-based fears of crowds, fears of insecurity, and fears of the unpredictability of modern life. These fears risk legitimizing a future that centers even more than is already the case on private and domestic life, which, in the age of Zoom, promotes a technology-enabled state of isolation, and indeed, one may say, a state of political disorganization. All of this this renewed fear of the crowd will make it hugely important for us, I think, to fight for transit, not only as a better means of transportation, not just on instrumental utilitarian grounds, but also as an enjoyable and desirable way of living life, a generous form of public space. And I think here we need to spend a lot of time, and I do this already with my students who don't believe me typically, but we do need to remind people that transit has not been a significant source of infection, according to all the studies that have been done on the subject in various parts of the world. Indeed, there have been studies who've shown that it's more likely, and I think there's a US study that has shown that it's more likely to be killed as a pedestrian or a cyclist on the street than to be infected with COVID-19 in the public transit system. On this front, of course, it will also be important to make transit as safe as possible. Service must be increased greatly to limit overcrowding. Personal protective devices must be readily available and mandatory. And I think we've talked about this before, earlier this year, transit policing, which is a major source of insecurity for many, must be abolished. Transit cops that enforce the fare base have been the source of so much anxiety among riders over the last few years, particularly those BIPOC folks who are routinely subject to racial profiling by police and security forces. So let me just finish by saying this on the last point anyway, that we can say that the fight for public transit is, of course, a fight for a different form of state intervention. It's a fight for a different way of producing and consuming life in a general sense, but it also is a fight for public life. It's a fight for politics, and it's a fight for our capacity to organize collectively and act collectively. Right? And I think in this sense, the vision that we've developed over the last few years here and in many other parts of the world, the vision for free transit is a vision for transit freedom in every sense of the term. Yes, in terms of fare freedom, but also in terms of freedom in other forms and other ways that transit could enable and encourage instead of counteracting.
Thanks, Stefan. Our next speaker is the ex-Scarborough activist Vincent Puhaka from TTC Writers.
It's a Sunday afternoon, but it's great we're all here, and hopefully we're going to learn something from each other about how to fight for public transit in this age of pandemic, which is always a tough thing. Stefan, thanks for that presentation. I always learn a lot when I listen to you, so it's fantastic. So everyone, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about, well, first of all, I'll be focusing particularly on the TTC because it's the work that TTC Writers does the most, and it's the transit system I'm most familiar with. But some of the things I'm going to talk about regarding transit in the pandemic are applicable to other urban centers in Canada. So just bear that in mind, but I'm sure you're all aware of that as it stands. So I'm going to start off, just give a little bit of an intro as to some of the reasons why transit in Toronto is particularly at risk during this time period, at risk of austerity, at risk of budget cuts. And talk a little bit about some of the effects of COVID-19 on public transit itself in Toronto. And then I'm going to leave off with some of the successes that TTC Riders has had in combating some of these negative trends. And then Shelagh will take it from there. So hopefully you'll be able to learn a lot. And like Herman said, just post some questions in the chat and we'll definitely have a Q&A afterwards. So what are the stakes really for public transit in COVID-19? Well, the TTC is actually the third most heavily used transit system in North America. It's important to point out because we're not the third largest metropolitan region in North America. So a lot of people are using transit in Toronto. In 2019, on an average weekday, almost 1.7 million passengers use the TTC, which, important to note, is also potentially large force if organized, and it's something that we as an organization have been pushing for quite some time. So lots of people are using transit in Toronto, but a negative fact about this is that majority of TTC's operating cost has been paid for by riders. This is expressed in something known as the fare box recovery ratio. So in 2018, and forgive the numbers from different years, but it's the stats that are available. In 2018, almost 70% of the cost of operating transit on a daily basis was borne by riders, and the city subsidy was closer to 30%, or just more than 30%. And until recently, there was no operational funding from higher orders of government, aside from a minute amount of gas tax money that would be used to purchase vehicles and things of that nature. So transit was already operating on tenterhooks even before this crisis. I think that's important to raise. It's part of the reason why fares have been going up faster than the rate of inflation. As we're all aware, when fares, or essentially a user fee, pay for most of the service's budget, it's profoundly inequitable and unfair. So related to that, if you're low income, a larger percentage of your income goes towards basic transportation. So the people least able to pay for transit are the ones funding it the most, which we can all agree is inequitable and unconscionable. The TTC is in fact the least subsidized major transit agency in North America, which translates to about $1 Canadian per rider in subsidy. You can compare this with $1.16 Canadian in Montreal, $1.52 per rider American in New York City, and so on and so forth, which is, again, pretty amazing considering we have the third most heavily used transit system in North America. So the higher orders of government simply are not coming to the table to provide riders with the service that they need. And COVID has shown us the vulnerability and moral weakness of this model. This economic crisis and a health crisis has tanked ridership and funding, so higher orders of government have the ability to fund transit equitably, yet have not done so. So I want to share with you guys actually a map, two maps that will illustrate some of the inequities of the situation we're in right now. Just give me a sec here. My internet has decided it wants to be slow. All right. So I think everyone can see this here. So I've called up, this is the City of Toronto's website that tracks COVID-19 cases per neighborhood. So if we toggle over to the option here that lists 21st right through to a few days ago, December 10th, we will see actually what Stefan brought up as well, that COVID-19 cases are concentrated in the northwest area of the city and to some extent in Scarborough, both of which are working class areas inhabited by people of color. So even this map will show you the inequities of COVID-19 in Toronto. I'm going to share with you a second map in just a few seconds. Here we go. So this is a map produced by a great activist and commenter on transit, Sean Marshall. This is an article from Spacing Magazine from April. And he's indicated here several bus routes that during the deepest portion of the pandemic, when ridership was tanking, were still overcrowded. And as you can see, they are bus routes that travel through either industrial employment lands, where a lot of folks who cannot work from home tend to work, and neighborhood improvement areas, which tend to be inhabited by working class folks and BIPOC folks. So the two are related. And the key point of this, really to point out, is that the language that transit has been abandoned by the population is partially true for those who can work from home, but for working class people, it simply didn't happen, and people were still using transit. So in April, the TTC had lost 80% of its ridership, but this was uneven. As you can see from the images I showed you before, crowding in suburban and low-income areas was still rife on the TTC. And ridership has increased during the summer, and crowding only got worse. So already we're seeing a flaw in the current funding model of transit, where overall ridership has declined. Those who need it most are still on the buses and crowded. So it's a big problem. And that's one of the key takeaways for transit during COVID-19. Subsequent to all this, we have had a so-called safe restart agreement with money starting to flow in the fall from a joint federal provincial agreement. So that amounted to $404 million for the TTC in phase one of the safe restart agreement, which is fine as far as it goes. It does mark, to my understanding, the first flowing of operations money from higher levels of government since the 90s, since Mike Harris cut that in the 90s. So that's a fairly big deal. The problem is that phase two comes with a fair number of conditions. So some of you may remember from the news that Doug Ford is demanding that transit systems that accept phase two funding, safe restart funding, are required to evaluate low performing bus routes and possibly replace them with microtransit. So Stefan was talking about the platform monopolists. Well, here's their opportunity to take over transit in the suburbs and in peri-urban areas. There's a big problem with this safe restart agreement. I will mention this later on, but TTC Riders and allies have been calling for the transit funding to be made permanent from the federal government, and to also come with no strings. Because right now there isn't enough funding to meet the need. And in the new year, municipalities are facing a further shortfall in their transit operations. Another aspect of transit during COVID-19 is somewhat positive. The TTC did implement a series of bus lanes, Eglinton East, Kingston Road, and Morningside in Scarborough. Jane Street north from Eglinton to Steeles Avenue will be implemented next year. The problem is there are a number of other locations that as being good candidates for transit priority measures: Steeles West, Finch East, Dufferin, Lawrence East, among others. None of these have dates attached. Once more, and I would refer you guys back to this map of overcrowded buses in the suburbs. Once more, these areas that need good transit aren't going to get it in the near future. It's also important to note that the TTC has used these bus lanes as an excuse to cut stops and as an excuse not to increase service on those routes, using the argument that the bus lane makes it more efficient, quote unquote, the favorite language of right-wing politicians everywhere. So those are three problems that transit is dealing with during COVID-19: overcrowding, funding that comes with conditions, and very slowly implemented bus lanes. There are others, but these are three that TTC Riders has been working on over the past couple months. Well, what's next for public transit? Municipalities in Ontario face a $6.8 billion shortfall in operations. Toronto faces a $1.5 billion shortfall in operations. Municipal governments are unable to run deficits, and the mainstream media is already talking about coming austerity. What does this mean? This means that transit riders and other poor and working class folks are going to be paying for the pandemic going forward. So this is something that we as progressives and as leftists need to push against, and something that TTC Riders will be doing so going forward. So what has TTC Riders done? over the course of COVID-19? Well, we've done a lot with a very limited set of resources. We have worked with allies to push for that safe restart funding. It's not perfect, but some of it's there. We did convince City Hall to fast track the bus-only lanes on Eglinton East. Of course, we had a one step forward, two steps back sort of situation with the removal of local bus stops. We have pushed the TTC successfully to distribute masks. TTC will be restoring some of the cut service that took place in March over the course of this fall and winter. We've surveyed transit riders about their concerns, which amount to service and crowding, no surprise. And we had a very successful rally with local allies at the office of VJ Thenigasalam out in East Scarborough. And as well as continue to speak at TTC board meetings and this sort of thing we've always been doing. So there's a fair amount of pushback coming from a grassroots organization like ourselves, but the problems are, I would say, immense. As I mentioned before, and Shelagh is probably going to get into this actually after I'm done, but the need for permanent transit funding right now is paramount, given the potential for austerity coming down the pipe. The bus lanes absolutely need to be expanded over the course of the next, ideally, few years, as opposed to waiting to 2031 like the city wants to do. And those bus lanes need to be maintain local service without removing stops and hurting working class communities. We have a municipal and provincial budget process coming up in the spring, starting in 2021, as another opportunity for us and allied progressives to attempt to limit and stop the coming austerity. And really, I mean, you're all here today listening to a presentation on public transit, which means you're somewhat interested in the issue. And my pitch to you is to get involved with TTC Riders or like-minded organizations where you live, because it's very, very important that not only do we save transit going forward, but that transit becomes a true opportunity to move beyond car use and all the associated problems with that. Stefan talked very well about that. I'm not going to bother stealing his thunder. But yes, my pitch to you would be to get involved, because these are issues that aren't going to go away.
Okay, Vincent, once again, you did a great job. So next we're going to go to Shelagh, and Shelagh is the all-purpose activist and around the TTC Riders. Pretty amazing activist. Shelagh? Yeah.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to having a discussion with all of you. You know, like Vincent and Stefan have said, the next 3 to 6 months are absolutely critical for the future of public transit. And I'm going to speak a little bit about how TTC Riders organizes and some of the potential that I think that there is in organizing transit riders. But I just wanted to start by, I have some images to show, but I wanted to start by sharing a bit of a personal story, because a year ago today, I would not have been able to do this webinar. I actually suffered a very serious concussion last fall. And for about 4 of the past 12 months, I was not able to be online or do anything like this. And but TTC Riders really rose to the occasion and got active last year in the city budget. But one of the things that our board asked me to do was write out a list of people that they could call on to step up and get more involved while I was sort of out of the picture. And I wrote down from memory a list of 50 people, and I still have it with me because I just, yeah, it's really inspiring. Like, there's so much potential within TTC Riders, people that are passionate about transit, who will do things when asked. And since last year, I would add 20 or 30 more names to this list of really core people. You know, people like, some of the notes are, you know, this person lives in Etobicoke, would do graphic design if we asked, might speak to the media if we provided coaching. So yeah, I kept this partly because I like to try to be systematic about relationship building and following up with people, but also because I think there's so much potential in this organization and of transit as an issue that affects hundreds of thousands of people in Toronto in a really deep way, especially right now. The people who are riding transit depend on it. And Stefan talked a bit about transit dependency, but I think we've been trying to reframe that and talk about how we are all depending on public transit, because the people who are still using it work in grocery stores, they work in hospitals. It's not just transit riders, it is like a life-giving public service that we all depend on. And so we all have a stake in seeing it happen, or sorry, in seeing it be funded and make sure it doesn't fail. And so, but, you know, just to go back to this list of people, I have relationships with all, you know, like 50, 80 people that I just can think of off the top of my head, but that's not, you know, that can't scale up. Even connecting with 80 people, that's just, it's not possible to have a really deep relationship with that many people. And so what TTC Writers needs to grow is more people taking on leadership roles. So do we need more people who can give public talks and talk to the media? Absolutely. But what we really need are people who are willing to sit with someone for an hour to prepare them to speak to the media, or who are sort of taking responsibility for a small group of people to kind of check in with them and train them to take on more leadership roles. So I'm going to speak a bit about, oh yeah, I'm going to share my slides. And I'm going to speak in, okay, where's the chat box gone? But yeah, I'll speak a little bit in a moment about how we organize and a little bit about how we try to structure our outreach work. But I wanted to share this inspiring image. This is from this fall, and something new to TTC Riders that you might not know about, but I think is one of the most exciting new things we're doing, is that we launched an organizer school. And we were just lucky to get a grant that funded this work this year, but we hope to be able to fundraise to continue it. And it's modeled on the Workers Action Center Feet on the Ground program, where people take part in a 6 to 8 month leadership training program. So we're meeting every month for a day-long training, but people are also getting a scholarship to support them doing an organizing practicum. So there's massive potential in our organization, but also in the issue of transit, because it's so deeply felt by people in Toronto. And so the other 2 points I wanted to make are really about organizing at the local level, and I want to share some examples and stories about how that's been playing out. This is an image that a bus driver emailed me 2 days ago. The TTC is about to, on Tuesday, make a decision about its service plan for the next year. And, you know, as Vincent and Stefan have mentioned, if the TTC does not get more or hopefully permanent operating funding, we could see more service reductions on the horizon. We're certainly anticipating fare increases. The good news is that, unlike in the United States, the TTC is not, you know, proposing outright to cut back service massively, but it is kind of tweaking and making little changes, like the removal of local bus stops on Eglinton. And here's an example that the bus driver shared with me. In the purple circle is a little jog that his bus route takes through an industrial area. And he said the TTC is planning to get rid of this in the service plan. I don't know if you noticed, and I hadn't, because I don't know the area very well. He said factory workers are going to have to walk an extra 10 or 15 minutes through the industrial park. Do you think we can do something about this? And this is a perfect example of how powerful it can be to organize at a local level. But we can only do that if we have local people willing to lead, or a team willing to lead. So this is a great, I just wrote back to him with some ideas. But if anybody here is really keen on this, this is in the northwest of Toronto. This is sort of in between Keele and Steeles is at the top there. So these are people going to work in factories who depend on transit. There might be a lot of potential to organize around this issue, but what it will take is, you know, postering on that route, following up with people who get in touch with us. I suggested to the bus driver, maybe you could call through some of the areas, or even just think about, who do we know? Do we know if any of the workplaces are unionized? So this is an example of what we can do at the local level. And here we've tried to do this on Eglinton East, but the difference is we had people, local members, including somebody who's in our transit organizer school, who lives along Eglinton East, who's directly affected by the removal of the local bus stops. So we had a volunteer put together posters that show which stops are being removed. We've had poster teams go out. We've had people flyer in their buildings. And when something affects you locally, people are just far more likely to get involved. I think, obviously we see the big picture as being about transit funding and making sure that the service can continue, but people are more responsive when something is affecting them at the local level. So here's a picture of one of our poster teams out on Eglinton East, I guess. I think that was in October. And yeah, here's another example. We tried to kind of make some hay out of the conditions attached to the Safe Restart Agreement. Of course, we don't actually know how this is going to play out, but one of the conditions in the funding agreement is that the TTC will have to evaluate low-performing routes. And so a volunteer produced these incredible maps and posters where we mapped out what are all the routes that have fewer than 4,000 daily riders. Like, where might this actually affect you locally? And people postered along some of the routes that could be affected by these cuts. And then just looking ahead at sort of what's coming up and how to get involved, I just wanted to share like some of the key city meetings, but also this is a graphic that we made just yesterday, I guess, or a couple days ago, that the TTC, public participation has been really limited in the official city channels during COVID-19. So we try to get people out to some key TTC board meetings and go in person, and there can be a really great feeling of solidarity and when you're there with a big team of people, and that's really different online. But nonetheless, the TTC is still trying to limit participation as much as possible. And I think that to me is just a testament of the fact that when we do organize and get people there, they do feel pressure, because this year they're holding their budget meeting 3 days before Christmas. They really don't want people at this meeting. So we think that it will be pretty ugly, that they're likely to propose a serious fare increase to make up the difference of the funding gap. Then the TTC board, unlike previous years, they're not going to meet again until February, 8 days before the final city budget. And that really reduces the opportunity for councillors to pose questions of staff. So if they were meeting in January, at the budget meeting this month, councillors might request a report about some of the details in the proposed budget. That's just not that. There's just a limited opportunities now for councillors to even interrogate what's being proposed. And then we don't know if this is going to happen, but we expect to just have a few days of seeing the budget. But despite the fact that there's limits, we are planning to bring people out to the December 21st budget to speak against any fare increase. And we're holding a press conference next week to try to get ahead of the message to, the message that we're thinking of is that transit riders shouldn't pay the price of the pandemic. Essential workers shouldn't pay the price of the pandemic with fare increases. We're holding a training next week to prepare people for the budget meeting. And then something I wanted to share with you all, we don't have materials ready, but especially groups like Free Transit Toronto might be interested in this, that in January, the TTC is launching a 5-year fare policy review. It's kind of a mouthful, but basically they're launching a public consultation process. They're looking at everything from free fares to full cost recovery. They're also going to be looking at how they collect fares and study this over the next 6 to 8 months and bring a report back in the fall. So we see this as a huge opportunity to shape the conversation around fares, especially around 3 key issues: affordability, Presto and all the equity issues that it causes, where you can't purchase Presto products at a convenience store. You have to live near a Shoppers Drug Mart or a subway station, which really cuts out access for a lot of suburban residents. And then thirdly, of course, fare policing. So what we're planning is a public launch in January to share some engagement tools. We're going to have a survey, but we're also hoping to talk to thousands of transit users through sort of story circles to surface people's experiences, kind of get testimony, but also to build our base of riders. And then in the summer, kind of release a report or start holding some bigger public events and rallies to advance our vision for fares. So that's sort of all I had to present. So maybe I'll stop sharing my screen and we can just open it up to conversation.
Thank you, Sheila. People want to ask questions. Just put your hand up. All right, Donald, you wanted to raise a question?
Yeah, briefly. I mean, those are three great and inspiring presentations. I just a couple of points. I mean, I think it's an opportunity as well as a threat, and that in a sense of concern with climate change gives us a bit of a leg, and where we could build support, I think, around some more positive demands. I'm speaking of Ottawa, I guess, but certainly around more bus-only lanes as a way of improving the transit system, and some partial free fare mechanism. We had an interesting development here, whereas one of the big community health centers has just issued a report based on a major consultation with their constituents, calling for free fares for OW and ODSP recipients. So I mean, this is the first time in Ottawa that a really grassroots group has come up with this kind of demand. What we've basically had is calls for fare freezes, which don't inspire any enthusiasm at all. Well, I mean, this is something that we could organize around. And I think the idea being that if one is going to save public transit, we need to make it more attractive. So I'll leave it at that.
Actually, the demand around the Fair Fare Coalition, that was part of TTC Riders and still is, remains like free fares for people on social assistance and ODSP, and dramatically reduced fares like $50 fares for people on low incomes. And they got the Fare Pass, which was basically at the level of seniors, which isn't huge. And even now they're bucking that. But so those demands remain, and they were the demands that were generated by the people themselves who were involved in it. It was pretty it was a pretty excellent movement. Right now, that it's like.
If I could just add, Herman, we've had quite a debate, especially in Free Transit Ottawa, but more broadly, around the use of means tests, which are very ineffective ways to make lower fares available to people. And taking that issue up has drawn other constituents into the debate. And there's now a growing consensus that one has to deal with categories of people that don't require additional means testing in order to make those improvements. I mean, here Ottawa has a low income pass. It's a very high low income, and only 8,000 people in the city are eligible for it. But after like 4 years and a big organizing campaign by ACORN, the local anti-poverty group, the take up is like 50%.
Greg, do you have your hand up?
I was just curious about the reading of different levels of the state and the funding of transit and where people think it's at. Seems to me that Trudeau did not overturn much of Harper's open federalism, as he called it. That is the almost limited interventions in provincial jurisdictions. And when they intervened, it was always on very targeted single kind of project funding. The logic inside the Trudeau government is still with Harper, in the sense of no systematic new programs. And when you have them, to P3 everything on an individualized basis as well. Am I misreading on the transit area that that's still where they're stuck at? And it seems to me at the provincial government, at the provincial level, they have not yet wanted to roll back any of the commitments towards funding some of the transit expansion. So they've kind of sustained them, but they are kind of hinting or seeming to back off even more of funding operating expenses. And so you have between the two levels of government, which are so crucial to funding these massive scale of transit expansion or to sustaining services in any of the cities that are above 500,000, an incredible kind of contradiction between the way they're funding and the need. And it's just almost impossible to see how they're going to get out of it. You know, at the local level, I would think Sheila was pointing out, you know, the likely pressure to raise fares while saying they're committed to supporting low-income people by not ditching the low-income pass, but just finding ways to limit who can access to it and making it as difficult as hell to access to. So we've got these incredible contradictions around transit funding across all the levels of the state. At the same time, in one sense, that the pressures to fund it better are incredibly strong, powerful on how to cope with the pandemic for work, getting people to work, but also for people's leisure, and for climate change, and so on. And you know, what is one of the most underfunded areas of infrastructure in the country, and you know, we're so far behind other places now in the quality and performance of transit. The final thing I just want to ask, just how you guys are reading, but the other one is, to me, this has always had the sense that at some level we needed a national campaign or national set of demands in around transit and transit funding. The last moment it came forward at any significant way was Chow for like a year, and typical of Olivia, she lost her attention span and moved on to something else, as well as kind of the NDP marginalized it before. But it was, you know, it began as got a lot of attention. It was a decent campaign, particularly actually coming from her because she was so invested in the transit issue in Toronto when she was council here. But it seems to me none of the parties have really taken this up at all. And it's not even high on their agenda either for ecology reasons, green reasons, or for just as a basic core aspect of social provisioning for quality of life and egalitarianism, justice, as Stefan began his presentation with it. You know, one of the areas that we can bring justice, and that is also anti-capitalist or anti-commodification at the same time.
Anyone else want to raise a question or make a point? Yes, Karim? And
Yes,
then
thank you. So I have a question for the group. One of the things that I find really interesting, and I'm not sure if any of the groups touched up on it, is I'm interested to know what does the general public feel about public transit? Like when you say the word public transit, what images like conjure up in people's minds and what thoughts? Because I feel like this is a very strong baseline that we really need in order for us to build anything on it. Like I see a lot of people take sort of this issue for granted and they jump into like environmentalism or anything of that sort. But I feel like it's really interesting just to find out what people really know and think about like public transit and have engagement, like a broader engagement for people that don't necessarily use public transit. And so I'd be curious to know if groups have done any work with that regards. Yeah.
I'll take one more comment question. Eric, you had your hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on what Greg was saying about the upper levels of government. As Vincent pointed out, the province of Ontario does not allow municipalities to run deficits, which Mike Harris used to squeeze various municipalities, especially Toronto at the time of amalgamation here. And of course, Ford is doing the same. The province also prohibits a lot of measures that municipalities could use to raise money on their own. They're not allowed to engage in, I think it's called indirect taxation. And the few things that they're allowed to do, in fact, the Liberal government of Kathleen Wynne prevented the city from tolling the Don Valley Parkway, which was going to go towards transit, I believe, the funds raised from that. So the province is in a sense the biggest villain here upper level government, the feds, their constraints, I guess, on their money, although part of it's provincial constraints, but they've been shoveling out a lot of money out the door. As far as I can tell, the province is not. And yet the media and public discourse in general keeps focusing on the federal government, and there's not much pressure on the province for this sort of thing, as far as I can tell. And I wonder why that is, and if there's some way of reversing it.
All right, let the people, the panel respond to those points, whichever one you want. Stefan, you want to go first?
Okay, well, I don't have too many things to add. I mean, on Dawn's point about climate change being, not going away, unfortunately. Yes, this I think is an opportunity, and I think it speaks also to Sheila's point about us all depending on transit, not just some people. I think this is a very good point to make. I just remember reading some calculations about the implications of every 10% of decrease in transit ridership in France and in the Paris region. The implications for climate change and corridor orientation are unbelievable. They're absolutely staggering. And so I think that must be a fundamental sort of point of attack, it seems to me, for us when we talk about transit. For sure. I think, in terms of the senior levels government, this would be interesting to hear from Greg and others about this in terms of the province. It's certainly true that Ford has been getting away with a lot of things. And one thing is, indeed, he's been able to hide underneath the feds and their public profile with respect to pandemic intervention, and not doing anything at the provincial scale that helps us. I mean, there's been all sorts of stuff going on, of course, at the provincial level, but not things that matter to us in terms of social justice and environmental intervention. On the contrary. And I do think there's a certain kind of radicalism there that doesn't speak its name. I think Ford has learned from probably some of the people that worked with Harper and Harris to kind of not polarize all the time and kind of fly under the radar whenever it's convenient and possible. And yet I think that the kind of radicalism that the Queen's Park is pushing is quite astounding, particularly on environmental protection issues that I think we've probably heard about this, deregulation of conservation authorities and land use planning and all the rest of it, which has already been extremely developer friendly before. But I mean, they really are kind of suggesting to get rid of much of any limited obstacle that is still in the way of untrammeled privatized development of any sorts, which doesn't bode well, of course, for transit. So I think the province obviously has to be a key target. Vincent? And I actually wonder about this. I had a question on this front, actually. Sorry, to Vincent and Sheila on the TTC Writers' perception of all of this. I mean, how do you think of the province today in terms of a possible target of action? Generally speaking, in Ontario, but also perhaps in a GTA context. Have you been thinking about this recently? And if yes, what's your thinking?
Vincent?
Okay, so there's a lot going on right now. A lot of questions going on. So Greg and Eric, I know you were somewhat touching on really the higher levels of government and how they play out in the transit space. And obviously, I think this group would agree the endless back and forth of liberal and conservative, liberal conservative, same story, whatever, liberal Tory, same old story, that sort of deal. We know that's true. I want to really break down, I guess, sort of why that might be. So the reason I mentioned during my little talk about the sheer number of transit riders in Toronto, and of course we can just add in the sheer number of transit riders in Ottawa and the greater GTA and London, Ontario, and so on and so forth, is potentially. And
you missed that last bit there, Vincent.
Did I just cut out for some reason?
Yeah,
okay.
Just for a second. Yeah.
Okay. What I was I mentioned the fact there's a large number of transit riders in Toronto and in other cities is because potentially transit riders are a very large constituency, and currently they do not act as such. When we do organizing work amongst transit riders, and prior to the pandemic, myself and many others would be out at a subway station, let's say, trying to talk to people about, let's say it was the subway upload that Doug Ford was trying to do. And people have no idea this is happening to them. And people are beat down and working 3 jobs. And so the potential transless liberal conservative revolving door is very large, but the potential has not been realized. And so how do we change that? Well, we're trying to, right? Shelagh talked about in her presentation about how we are really trying to grow new organizers all over the city, but particularly in areas of high transit use and high working class BIPOC people, this sort of thing. And that has to keep going, even in this time of pandemic, because that's how you activate the riders as a constituency and really pressure these upper levels of government with that sheer people power. Hasn't happened yet. We're working at it. We're doing our best. And I guess the last move on to Shelagh would be, Karine, you mentioned how people see public transit, which was a really interesting question. I'd love to unpack that more. My understanding, and maybe Shelagh, you can disagree with me, or Stefan, you can disagree with me or agree with me, is that a certain percentage of transit riders don't want to be transit riders because the greater weight of our society is on getting a car and being a car person, and transit is seen as being like you failed at life and this sort of thing. And it somewhat intersects with being working class and how does one prove to be middle class. There's a lot of issues to unpack there. And again, that's why we're trying to really activate transit riders as a constituency, because people don't realize that potentially they can make change and that potentially they do have power. There's a lot going on there. I could talk forever about that, but I'll stop now.
Shelagh?
Sure. Yeah, just to pick up on what Kareem talked about how do people view public transit, and Stefan mentioned, I think that overwhelming sentiment right now is fear. And Stefan mentioned that, there hasn't been any conclusive evidence that COVID-19 is spreading on public transit. But the reality right now is that the growing anti-mask movement has meant that there are more and more people on transit who are not wearing masks. And I think that is a legitimate fear. And there's a tension there where we want to save public transit, talk about how we're all depending on it, but also that we need to press the TTC to do more, hand out more masks, and we have to kind of speak to both of those pieces. But I think people's attitudes towards public transit are really shaped by, their everyday experience. So some people, and you might have a mix of feelings about public transit, see it as something that gets you where you need to go and have a positive vision, but also we hear a lot of people who talk about how they want to see the TTC privatized because they do a bad job. And that is really the result of coming back to the provincial funding piece, like the end game around what the provincial government is hoping to achieve with these conditions of the Safe Restart Agreement, and the really constant attacks on the TTC and attempts to privatize it. It's not, that threat is not going to go away. There's very powerful interests, Uber lobbyists connected to the provincial government, and the underfunding of transit is not just an economic decision, but ideological, and it makes transit unattractive to people because it's underinvested in. But in terms of where to focus, I think the federal level is perhaps more strategic, because the federal Liberal government did make an election promise to make public transit funding permanent, not operating funding, but they've also made commitments around climate change. So they're perhaps more vulnerable to, they might be more open to making some climate change commitments, but the provincial government, they've been very clear, this is a one-time funding thing, the Safe Restart Agreement. The other thing we haven't talked about is fare integration. That's the other sort of condition around the Safe Restart Agreement. The Toronto Board of Trade has recently put out a new a proposal for what fare integration in the region might look like, and it's very aspirational. But the reality is that Metrolinx wants to see fare by distance, potentially fare by mode, like higher fares for subway and rapid transit. So yeah, we definitely would like to, we anticipate a fare increase and certainly need to be active at the city level, but the real culprits are the provincial and federal government for not funding transit. So that's sort of how we want to use the next few months.
Yeah, just a couple of short points. One is that you might remember when the provincial government was threatening to take over the subways, and there was quite a movement challenging that. And it's interesting how it crisscrossed people who were pissed off about the TTC, about breakdowns and stuff. If there ever was, in my memory, a time where, at least in Toronto, where there was a movement that was willing to take steps, tactical steps, because people were pissed off about enough, it was then. We've lost a lot of that part because of all the things that people have said, and also because of the pandemic. But you get those moments, and my guess is there will be in the future. And the other thing is that Toronto, there are pockets of areas where, like Vincent was, when people, you're sort of a loser because you got to take public transit. You get a car. But there are also pockets of Toronto where you have people who are working people of moderate income, not aside from people in the lower incomes, who feel perfectly comfortable taking TTC, and they got pissed off when it had breakdowns and that sort of stuff. Whereas in other cities, I was in Regina, I had to do a talk with the ATU there, and it's only the poor people that are supposedly use public transit, and the really bad and racist notions permeate the culture of a lot of one grouping of certainly the elite folks, but also in the I was shocked in terms of the way some of the transit workers had it. So it's different here. Greg, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I just trying to think through the excellent presentations, and then a couple of things that Stefan and Vince and everybody posed back to, and Sheila posed back to us as well. Maybe at the provincial level, I see little room in terrain. Ford has given us like soft voice neoliberalism in the last months, and we have dealing with the pandemic through mainly neoliberal modes of responsibilization, and all those things that have to do with building up some sort of administrative and state capacity have kind of not been taken up in any systematic way, and are sloppy or even sloppier given the conditions of the pandemic than they were before. And it seems in the area of transit, or Ford can't pull back on the lines because he's got 2 years to run, and if he sees he's pulled back on anything, he's got no hope to win the election. So he's got to kind of sustain those balls in the air at least till the next election to kind of hope he can kind of hold seats in Toronto and not lose them all, as the Tories did federally. Mulroney is obviously playing, what she's been doing as transport minister when moving over there. I'm not sure what the politics were of it, if it's given how it's such a difficult area to operate when the government doesn't want to fund anything. I think Ford must have stuck her there to keep her under control, so her kind of leadership ambitions or building a faction inside cabinet, we're going to keep that bay. And her strategy has been to try and monetize everything they can in and around the transit portfolio, all the development stuff, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the way they've also been dealing with local government issues. The Parliamentary Budget Office, or not the Parliament, whatever it is at the provincial level, last week came up with their report, which detailed kind of that same kind of monetization and marketization efforts and constraints operating at that level. And it was amazing in a budget coming out of in the midst of this pandemic that we have a provincial government that is still focused on reductions of per capita provisioning in the province. So this is fucking crazy. And it's it's the same thing. That's the modes are so locked in since Bob Rae completely fixed under the Liberals, and again accelerated again by Ford. They're not overturning them even in the midst of this pandemic. At the national level, I just don't see whatever the guarantees that Trudeau put. It's like a budget item that says they're going to allocate so much to transit, but they're going to maintain the form of it without a policy. So they're going to maintain and practice, my view, of Trudeau's, of Harper's open federalism, where those kinds of monetary expenditures to the local level are all on a one-off ad hoc basis, but they're just going to keep a budget item of some kind. I don't know. I don't know what it would break us open, even at a coalitional level in this country to get some measure of a national grouping together. Maybe it's something we should be pushing Lascaris to do as one of the foundations for his kind of post-leadership run that he took on this as one of the things to carry into the ecological movement, as well as kind of building his own base and being, it's the kind of area that he'd be able to have a dialogue with both left parties if he took it on as one of the core things, as one of his core climate change platforms, if he was going to sustain building something like he said. Other than that, it's just hard to see what it's coming from.
I saw this Richard, you're here, Richard Fiddler, grouping within Quebec Solidaire had an excellent statement.
That was really
building
good.
An eco-socialist movement within grouping within that party, and it was there. It's impossible to really build the kind of thing we need nationally around public transit without ties to an ecological future. And it really requires, like you think of countries that don't have this debilitating federalism that we have here, where in fact it's pretty clear that the highest levels of government have to fund one of the most expensive social programs, which is absolutely necessary, which is public transit. And here we're working with these different levels and trying to get the best we possibly can out of it. You need this has to be tied to bigger movements. Richard, you had to
I was just going to make one more quick point on this, is at the local level. I think the local level, our struggle is around provisioning policing and fares. And obviously the structure around those the basic orientation around those is radical and where we want to go, and the position of transition that's been putting forward by TTC Riders is all points in the right direction. It's kind of things that we can campaign for right now. But I think the other thing that we have to figure out is probably make sure when any kind of local anti-austerity coalitions start forming around the province, that kind of transit figures as one of the most prominent provisioning things in that fight back, simply because of its ecological and its egalitarian implications of providing proper transit provisioning.
And if you fall behind, you know what the costs are, because that's what happened with the drought. Yes, Richard?
Yes, the discussion here is very much being around the particular problems you're encountering with TTC Riders and so on, and the challenges there. There is a good question that someone, Nathan, I think, put in the chat area. Need a coordinated bus train service from the Atlantic to the Pacific. I think it's good that we should start also thinking about how we can raise these broader national or pan-Canadian issues, and putting the whole transit question in that framework. One other, it's astounding actually when you think about it, that we do not have any means of traveling from one end of the country to the other now, other than an automobile or an airplane. And those are two extremes. We have no national bus service. We have no cross-country regular day-to-day train service. And that's astounding. That's a real setback from what existed many years ago. I worked for 5 years for CN and CP on the dining cars from coast to coast, St. John, New Brunswick to Vancouver.
Oh.
And I saw the country as a student in the 60s, and summer jobs and winter jobs too sometimes. So I just took it for granted that you could do these things. And I traveled across the country by bus several times, hitchhiking sometimes, and so on. But we don't have that. Greyhound went out of business, basically, except between Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa. And so that's one issue that we really should be looking at. Another one, which I think is a more general one, but which has come more and more to the fore recently, I've noticed, is the 15-minute city. That is that you try to have develop neighborhoods where you can access all the main resources you need within 15 minutes walk of your home or a bicycle ride or whatever. I've been living in this myself for the last 5 or 6 years since I sold my car. And I just have a bicycle and I walk. And I'm fortunate that I live in a downtown part of Ottawa where I can actually access, I have access to the 15-minute city, although we're just going to lose our repertory theater, unfortunately, nearby. But anyway, it does change your life a little bit, and you start to take a much greater interest in your local community too, which is important. So these are just things to think about in terms of the broader situation that we also need to address much more, I think. And they've started to do that in Quebec with the formation of this Révolution éco-socialiste. We'll see what that produces. Their launch, by the way, is on Tuesday night. For those of you who can follow French, the details are in Presse Trois Gauche. And you can see it. It'll be right up prominently featured.
Okay, so we're going to have some time for Stefan, Vincent, and Sheila to say some final things. And you want to, Stefan?
Yeah, just briefly on Richard's point. Again, I think the national question is obviously important, and I think it's a difficult one given the size of this country, which I always say is not a country but a sort of a continental empire, right? So
Yes.
it's a difficult situation. But as you say, it's not as if geographical distance is an absolute obstacle. Things can be done. Just one point though about the 15-minute city, which is a kind of which is an idea that really repackages most of the sort of planning ideas that have become mainstream over the last 50 years under a new terminology. And I'm personally quite sympathetic to it, but I think one of the difficulties is that it is being taken up, by the mayor of Paris, for example, and a number of big city mayors, where this is sort of like a reality that is already partly in place, right? I think one of the challenges really is that for most urbanites in Europe and North America and many other parts of the world, they live in spaces that are not designed to be multifunctional, and so daily life is difficult to integrate in that way for most people who live in the Toronto area. So the question that what I would suggest is therefore not to abandon the idea, but to raise the question, what would be a 15, 20, 25-minute city look like if you were to replicate it a number of dozen times in the Ottawa area, in the Montreal area, in the GTA, and so on? That is a very good way to think about, and I think there is an opportunity here, because one of the things that's happened during the pandemic is that because of the lockdown, a greater proportion of people were essentially forced to rediscover their neighborhoods and their districts, which they typically don't really use except as a way to reproduce themselves, right? I mean, to put it slightly cynically, but the lockdown has sort of pushed a certain kind of possibility of decentralization, which may not be only a bad thing if we can find a way of re-centralizing functions in various parts across those sprawling suburban areas, right? And so the question, again, to us, I think, is what would a 15-minute city look like in Brampton and in Orangeville and in Newmarket? And I think it's a useful challenge to think about. It's difficult though, because the bias that there is a very strong central city bias in that conception.
Vincent?
Okay, so you know what? This conversation was just fascinating, and there's so much to unpack. I'll just leave you guys with some final words. So Stefan, you bring up an interesting point about the relevance of something like the 15-minute city to a lot of the areas that people actually live in contemporary Canada. So I'm lucky in that I can live in downtown Toronto. I have basement apartments, how I'm able to afford it. But most people aren't doing this. I grew up in Scarborough. Most people are living in environments like Scarborough for whatever reason. Either they're wealthy and they want a big house, or they're low income, it's where they can live. So I went to York. A lot of the students that I knew, my friends, came from places like Mississauga and Brampton and Richmond Hill, places that are just not like so beyond the idea of urbanism that it's not even funny. So at TTC Writers, these are our people, actually. Like we've shown from the pandemic, these are the folks who are still riding transit because they need to. So how do we get to people like that? And I would say I have learned a lot by being part of a group like TTC Writers, because my initial mentality would be to just say, hey, we need a bus system across the entire country. And someone would look at me like, how is that relevant to my life? So I want those things. We have to come to people where they are. So we've been very, very successful at getting folks involved by touching the very local issues that matter to them, because it's all you really have time to care about now in this world of working 5 jobs to pay the rent. So the transit system is taking away a bus stop in your neighborhood. Boom, there's your entry point to getting someone involved in this case, transit activism. But you can extrapolate this idea to any other kind of cause that you might have. So we must always think of the big picture in our own minds and why we're doing this kind of work. But not everyone we speak to is going to be thinking necessarily about that. Not because I'm judging their intellectual capacity. I think everyone has lots of intellectual capacity, but it's just the time to do things and the concerns you have. So I think for us as folks on the left, we need to meet people where they are, and that's their entryway into building a better world. So those are my thoughts.
Sheila?
Maybe I'll just follow up quickly on what Richard said about national transit. I think my dad might be watching, and he used to work for CP as well. But the intercity service is so important. And the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry actually made a recommendation around public transit service. It's a safety issue for women, and people who live in rural areas accessing healthcare, I think, is really important. And there's so much we didn't touch on. Like I was just thinking about how we didn't talk about how the federal investments in transit infrastructure are all through the Canada Infrastructure Bank. The problems with the REM project in Quebec. But I think there is a small, I just want to touch on like a couple of possibilities for us, because I know now that there's people across Ontario, at least here on this call, that there is a small formation at the national level, like a small coalition of environmental and transit groups that's done a couple of things together. And I think maybe there's a possibility for us to work at the provincial level too, to push for permanent operating funding together. So I'd love to follow up with all of you about that. Donald, Richard, I'm not sure who else is from other cities, but let's definitely connect. I think there's an opportunity there.
To build a transit movement that's rooted in all these different places in city, across the city, is really difficult. When we started with either the free transit thing and TTC Riders, the idea of a transit movement was something that was sort of foreign to people. And I remember in Scarborough, Vincent, you might remember, we had this Scarborough Transit Action was Brenda, me, and a couple other people, and that was it. And it took a while before it reached people. It should be one of the things that we really get involved in. Thank you so much, Sheila, Vincent, and Stefan.